Douglas MacArthur was one of the US military's most celebrated and controversial commanders. His military service career is one of the most extensive and impressive in history, but it did not go unblemished. This episode will look specifically into one of the blemishes, that being Douglas MacArthur's blunder of the defense of the Philippines at the offset of the Pacific War. If you'd like to learn more about the Philippines campaign, please check out our episode on the defense of the Pacific. For many of you watching, these events will be taking place in far-off lands, and seeing it on a globe would help place the campaigns. Well, it doesn't get better than our sponsor, Mova Globes, a decorative globe with a unique twist. These globes rotate seemingly of their own accord, with no power source. That's because they absorb solar energy from the room's ambient light to power a magnetic rotation system hidden inside, meaning you get a dynamic rotating globe with no fuss whatsoever. If it seems a little too good, that's just because it's newly developed technology, with an ultra-low friction motor and something called micro-volume fluid levitation. Basically, Mova Globes just work on their own and look good doing it. As you've probably noticed, it doesn't need to be a globe of Earth. They have plenty of other planets to choose from, and even a few things that aren't planets, with over 40 designs in all. Whatever you choose, Mova Globes make for a great decoration and a cool gift for the person who has everything. Get 10% off a 6 or 8.5 inch Mova Globe by using our code Kings&Generals at movaglobes.com. Douglas MacArthur was born on January 26, 1880, at Little Rock Barracks in Little Rock, Arkansas, to Arthur MacArthur Jr. and his wife Mary Pinckney Hardy MacArthur. They had 3 sons, Douglas being the youngest, after Arthur III, born in 1876, and Malcolm, born in 1878. The family lived on a succession of army posts on the old American West, where Douglas, according to himself, learned to ride and shoot even before I could read or write, indeed almost before I could walk and talk. Douglas MacArthur was the military brat son of Arthur MacArthur Jr., who held an impressive military career, serving in the Union Army during the American Civil War and becoming Governor General of the Philippines. The stage was set for Douglas MacArthur to distinguish himself with an extensive military career, taking part in the Philippine-American War, Mexican Revolution, World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. He received an incredible amount of military service awards and became the youngest US Major General in 1925 at age 44. Yet many historians argue that his accomplishments were not based on merit alone. MacArthur's helicopter mom, nicknamed Pinky, followed him to every military station he served and used her influence as the wife of Commanding General Arthur MacArthur to make sure that her son received the kinds of postings that would move him ahead. Indeed, MacArthur seemed to go from glory to glory, from superintendent at West Point to Major General in the Philippines, bringing his mother along to Manila, where she would soon die in 1935. The same year, Douglas MacArthur was hired by his personal friend Manuel Quezon, President of the Philippines, to supervise the creation of a Philippine army. On December 31, 1937, MacArthur officially retired from the US Army, ceasing to represent the US, but continued as Quezon's advisor in a civilian capacity. Douglas MacArthur's legacy is marred by the criticism of his tactical skills and a diagnosis of extreme narcissistic personality disorder. MacArthur was incapable of accepting responsibility for his mistakes and was driven by his obsession with his public image. He went as far as to hire an entire public relations staff to promote his image with the American public. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would later become US President, said that MacArthur had an obsession that a high commander must protect his image at all costs and must never admit his wrongs. MacArthur would write in grandiose, self-glorifying prose, attributing much of the US Army's success to himself, often emphasizing the many awards he received throughout his career. He would often write sitting at his desk, wearing a Japanese kimono, smoking cigarettes out of a jeweled holder, and speaking of himself in third person, with a 15-foot high mirror behind his officer chair. On July 26, 1941, President Roosevelt federalized the Philippine Army and recalled MacArthur to active duty as a 2-star Major General, naming him commander of the US Army forces in the Far East. MacArthur had 2 war plans to follow to defend the Philippines. War Plan Orange dictated that the primary mission of the Philippine garrison was to hold the entrance to Manila Bay and deny its use to the Japanese. American troops were not to fight anywhere but in central Luzon. An initial protective force would have the main task of preventing enemy landings, but if this proved unsuccessful, it was to engage in delaying actions while withdrawing to the Bataan Peninsula, however not at the expense of the primary mission. The Philippine Army could be utilized to defend Manila Bay, but troops would not defend the entire archipelago. The withdrawal would require moving all necessary war supplies capable of supporting defensive operations by a force of 43,000 men for a period of 6 months to Bataan. War Plan Orange was superseded by Rainbow Plan 5, which came about as a result of Japan joining the Tripartite Pact in September 1940. It stipulated that the US would maintain a defensive stance against Japan until Germany and Italy had been defeated. By this time it was now called WPO3, and despite it being a sound defense plan, it meant that the Philippines was implicitly an acceptable loss. MacArthur regarded WPO3 as defeatist and too defensive, preferring an aggressive plan to defeat any enemy that attempted the conquest of the Philippines. He outright rejected Rainbow 5 as it implicitly accepted the loss of the Philippines. Almost from the date he was recalled on July 26, 1941, MacArthur began trying to replace WPO3 with his own, more aggressive plan. In July 1941, Major General Henry H. Arnold proposed reinforcing the Philippine Army Air Corps by sending 4 heavy bombardment groups and 2 pursuit squadrons. By the time the conflict began, 107 P-40 Tomahawk fighters and 35 B-17 bombers were in place in the Philippines. By October 1, 1941, MacArthur had persuaded the War Department to approve some of his concepts for the defense of the Philippines. MacArthur reported to Washington confidently that he would soon have 200,000 armed men, organized into 11 divisions, with corresponding Air Force, Corps and Army troops ready for combat, and that the arrival of the B-17s has changed the whole picture in the Asiatic area. He called for a change from WPO3 to a much riskier strategy. He would stage an aggressive beach defense with his large Filipino force and use the Far East Air Force and Navy submarines to destroy Japanese transports inbound for Luzon. MacArthur believed that the Japanese would not attack during the hot season, and therefore he would have until April 1942 to train and prepare his defenses. By then, the Filipino force he promised would be ready. However, by December 8, 1941, none of this was a reality. Washington was inspired by MacArthur's optimism and slightly amended Rainbow 5 on November 19, 1941. The amendments were orders for the aircraft of the Far East to attack any Japanese forces and installations within radius at the outbreak of war. Washington increased MacArthur's force numbers and supplied him with tanks, artillery and aircraft. By December 1941, MacArthur had 31,095 US troops, 130,000 undertrained and ill-equipped Filipino troops, 35 B-17s and 107 P-40s. The most crucial equipment shortfalls were in rifles and divisional light artillery. Most were equipped with World War I M1917 Enfields, and the divisions only had 20% of their artillery requirements. Admiral Hart had 3 cruisers, 13 World War I-era destroyers, 6 patrol torpedo boats, and 29 submarines. Washington had no illusions about the Philippines being capable of holding back a Japanese invasion, and ordered Admiral Hart to withdraw his fleet if attacked. WPO3 was still to be enacted at the offset of invasion, and MacArthur's beach defense was not to hinder its implementation. MacArthur instead implemented his own plan, dispersing his forces widely and thinly across 9 major Philippine islands, breaching WPO3. This meant that the vital war equipment was scattered with these units, and it would therefore be difficult to move to the Bataan Peninsula. He did this because he believed that the Japanese would not attack prior to April 1942. He thus had no realistic plan to defend the islands if attacked earlier. On November 27, 1941, numerous war warnings had developed, as well as a strong belief that war with Japan was imminent. An alert was radioed to all commands by General Marshall, including one to MacArthur, stating that if hostilities occurred, he was to carry out Rainbow Plan 5. Rainbow 5 called for MacArthur to conduct air raids against enemy forces and installations within tactical operating radius as soon as Japan committed the first act of aggression. Despite this, MacArthur pursued his beach offensive plan based on the forces he expected to have by April 1942. Within minutes of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor at 2:30 am on December 8, 1941, Manila time, the news was received by HQ in the Philippines and MacArthur was informed by 3 am. Brereton got the news at 4 am from MacArthur's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Sutherland, and immediately placed the Air Force on war alert. At 5 am, Brereton asked MacArthur permission to bomb Formosa, but he was denied access to MacArthur by Sutherland. Sutherland responded by insisting on a preliminary photo reconnaissance mission to find out what they were going to bomb at Formosa before doing so. At 5:30 am, MacArthur received a cable from Washington instructing him to execute War Plan 5 at once. Yet MacArthur seemingly did nothing. At 6:15 am, MacArthur was informed by Admiral Hart that Japanese carriers had bombed the American seaplane tender William B. Preston in Davao Bay on Mindanao. At 7:15, Brereton asked permission to bomb Formosa again, and Sutherland responded, "MacArthur said no, we must not make the first overt act. Your role is defensive for the time being." At 8, General Harvey H. Arnold called Brereton from Washington, warning him not to let his planes be attacked on the ground. Brereton began ordering his aircraft to circle the airfields by 8:30 am. At 9:25 am, Brereton was informed that Japanese bombers had attacked Tuguegarao Airfield and USA FFEE Summer HQ at Baguio. Brereton telephoned Sutherland, asking permission to bomb Formosa, and Sutherland refused yet again. At 9:40 am, Brereton received instructions to send a photo reconnaissance flight over Formosa, and if they identified targets, a bombing raid would be approved in the afternoon. At 10:14 am, MacArthur finally approved a bombing attack on Formosa. At 10:30, aircraft began landing to be refueled, and at 10:45, the B-17s were ordered to be armed with bombs, in anticipation of a launch at 2 p.m. to attack Formosa. At 12:35 p.m., 26 Nells and 27 Bettys bombed Clark Field, escorted by 34 Zero fighters, which strafed aircraft on the ground. 7 minutes later, 53 Bettys bombed Iba Field, and 51 Zero fighters strafed aircraft on the ground. Most of Brereton's aircraft at Clark Field Air Base were sitting on their airstrips when attacked. Of the 17 B-17s on the ground at Clark Field, 12 were destroyed and 4 damaged. 34 P-40s were destroyed on the ground or in aerial combat. Half of the Far East Air Force was destroyed on the ground in the first 45-minute attack, and in the following week, continued Japanese air attacks reduced Brereton's remaining aircraft to a handful of P-40s and B-17s. From December 17th to December 20th, realizing that there were not enough fighters to protect the B-17s, MacArthur ordered the remaining 14 B-17s to retreat to Australia. There was no formal investigation of what took place in regards to the failure preceding the bombings of Clark and Iba airfields. Many historians argue that MacArthur's personal 40-year friendship with President Quezon had a lot to do with what occurred. President Quezon had visited Tokyo in 1938, where Japanese officials told him that Japan had no aggressive intentions towards the Philippines and only wanted trade. The Philippines was approaching independent status, and Quezon naively believed that Japan might not invade them. Indeed, without its consent, the Philippines had been included in Japan's Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, giving Quezon some reason to believe they would be spared. Quezon was trying to avoid thousands of Filipino deaths and untold destruction. Quezon knew that if the US sent a bombing mission against Formosa, the chance of Japan leaving the Philippines alone was lost. What else might MacArthur defer to Quezon? MacArthur commanded the US forces, yes, but did not necessarily command the 130,000 Filipino troops. His control over them relied on Quezon's unequivocal support. On December 8, 1941, the 14th Japanese Army, led by Lieutenant General Homa Masaharu, began landing on Batan Island off the north coast of Luzon. 2 days later, landings were made on Camiguin Island, Vigan, Apari, and Gonzaga. On December 12th, the Japanese landed 2,500 men of the 16th Division at Legazpi in southern Luzon. On December 8, 1941, MacArthur should have implemented WPO-3 to begin the defensive withdrawal to the Batan Peninsula, giving his forces ample time to move the necessary war equipment, food and medical supplies, but he did not. Instead, he followed his own plan. Overestimating the ability of his Philippine forces, MacArthur chose to fight an offensive war on the beaches, despite losing his air force, and relying solely on the Navy's submarines to take down Japanese transports. The supplies earmarked for Batan under WPO-3 were thus advanced to forces all over the archipelago. Meanwhile, Admiral Thomas C. Hart withdrew most of his fleets from the Philippine waters, leaving only submarines in accordance with Rainbow Plan 5. The submarines would prove not very effective at thwarting Japanese transports, to the dismay of MacArthur, who asked Admiral Hart, "What in the world is the matter with your submarines?" It turns out that the submarines were armed with the untested Mark 14 torpedo, a grossly malfunctioning weapon. They were thus unable to sink a single Japanese warship during the invasion. Instead of sending his crack troops, the Philippine Scouts, 4th Marines or 31st Infantry, MacArthur sent the Filipino army to the beaches, stating that they were to be held at all cost. He kept 1/3 of his combat-trained regiments out of harm's way on Corregidor Island. As a result of this, only 1 battalion out of the 3 would actually engage against the Japanese before surrendering because of the layout of the island of Corregidor. MacArthur's confidence in the Filipino troops fell when the IJA rapidly advanced after landing at Lingayen Gulf on December 21st. By nightfall on December 23rd, they had marched 10 miles into the interior. On December 24th, 7,000 men of the 16th IJA Division hit the beaches at 3 points on the shore of Lamon Bay, where they found General Parker's forces dispersed and without artillery. The IJA consolidated their position and drove north to Manila. General Wainwright's poorly trained and ill-equipped 11th and 71st Philippine Divisions were unable to repel or pin down the enemy at the beaches. The 26th Philippine Scout Cavalry, who were better trained and equipped, advanced to fight the Japanese at Rosario, but were forced to withdraw after taking heavy casualties. It was on December 24th that MacArthur finally invoked WPO-3. He withdrew the Philippines government and his HQ to the heavily fortified island of Corregidor and ordered a general retreat of his troops on Luzon to the Batan Peninsula. Most of the troops on Luzon were able to retreat, but without most of their supplies, which had to be abandoned. The US and Philippine armies scattered across 8 of the other large Philippine islands were abandoned, along with their equipment. Despite losing his air force after the Navy's submarine failure and the dramatic loss of his beach warfare, MacArthur reverted to WPO-3 far too late to realistically implement it. When MacArthur finally enacted WPO-3 to withdraw to Batan, he did not allow himself enough time to gather the necessary food, water, and medical supplies. WPO-3 required supplies to sustain an anticipated 43,000 men for over 6 months. They only managed to stockpile enough supplies to survive a 30-day siege. They would ultimately succumb to disease and starvation, forcing a bitter surrender. Was Douglas MacArthur responsible for the loss of the Philippines? Not at all. Many variables were out of his control. However, for what was under his control during the initial invasion, he certainly bears much responsibility. Ultimately, it was his overconfidence in his own offensive plan, his inability to send a bombing raid on Formosa, and his blundering of WPO-3 that hampered the defense of the Philippines. To learn more about these events, please check out our episodes on the Battle of Bataan and the Battle of Corregidor to learn the fate of the Philippines. Next week we're going to talk about the first raids on New Guinea, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.